The morning mist hung low over the dense forest, casting an ethereal glow through the towering pines. Sarah and Mike Thompson had always loved hiking, but this time was different. Their 6-month-old daughter, Emma, slept peacefully in the baby carrier strapped to Mike's chest, her tiny hands curled into fists. The remote trails of Mount Baker National Forest stretched before them, wild and untamed. Sarah checked their GPS one more time, making sure they stayed on the marked path. "We should reach the lookout point in about an hour," she whispered, careful not to wake Emma. The forest whispered its ancient secrets around them. Branches creaked in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker's rhythmic tapping echoed through the trees. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of pine needles and wild herbs. But nature's peaceful symphony was suddenly shattered by Emma's piercing cry. The sound cut through the forest's quiet like a knife, bouncing off trees and echoing into the wilderness. Mike gently bounced Emma, trying to soothe her, but her cries only grew louder. "Maybe she's hungry," Sarah suggested, reaching for their backpack. But as she moved, something made her freeze. An inexplicable sensation crept up her spine, the feeling of being watched. High above them, perched on a rocky outcrop partially hidden by thick foliage, 2 amber eyes tracked their every movement. The massive figure remained perfectly still, its muscular body concealed in the shadows. The creature's ears twitched forward, focusing intently on the sound of the crying baby. Emma's wails continued to pierce the morning air, and Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she prepared the bottle. Mike scanned their surroundings, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. The marked trail seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, with dense forest pressing in on either side. Neither of them noticed the silent movement in the trees above, the careful placement of massive paws, the deliberate shift of powerful muscles. The creature moved like a shadow, drawing closer with each passing moment, drawn by something more powerful than mere hunting instinct. Emma's cries began to soften as she accepted the bottle, but the damage was done. Their presence had been announced to every creature within earshot. The forest had gone unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. Only the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze broke the silence. Sarah and Mike exchanged worried glances. Years of hiking experience had taught them that unnatural silence in the forest was never a good sign. Something was out there, watching, waiting. They just didn't know what or why. Through the dense forest canopy, a massive cougar moved with fluid grace, each step calculated and silent. Her muscular frame, nearly 8 feet from nose to tail, navigated the terrain with an ease born from years of experience. She was one of the largest cougars ever seen in these mountains, a fact that made local rangers both proud and wary. The sound of the baby's cries had stirred something deep within her, a memory, perhaps, or an instinct that defied explanation. Her usual hunting pattern would have taken her in the opposite direction, where deer were plentiful this time of year. Instead, she found herself drawn to these unfamiliar sounds. As she moved closer, her keen senses took in every detail. The scent of the humans, 2 adults and 1 tiny one, carried on the breeze. She could smell their fear beginning to surface, that distinct sharp note that usually triggered her predatory instincts. But today was different. The baby's cries awakened something else in her, something that made her pause and observe. From her vantage point in the trees, she watched the family with unusual interest. Her powerful muscles remained coiled, ready to move at a moment's notice, but not with the tension of an impending attack. Rather, she seemed to be assessing, calculating something beyond mere hunting strategy. The great cat's behavior was unprecedented. Typically, cougars avoided humans at all costs, especially in daylight hours. They were solitary creatures, preferring the cover of darkness for their hunts. Yet here she was, deliberately moving closer to these humans, drawn by an urge she couldn't ignore. Her massive paws made no sound as she crept along a fallen log, getting a better view of the small family below. The baby's cries had softened, but still tugged at something deep within her chest. Images flashed through her mind, memories of her own cubs from seasons past, their tiny mewling sounds so similar to this human infant's cries. The forest around them had grown eerily still. Other creatures sensed her presence and wisely kept their distance. But there were others out there too. She could smell them. The distinct scent of a coyote pack carried on the breeze, and something about their movement pattern concerned her. They were circling, testing the air, drawn by the same sounds that had attracted her. The cougar's ears flicked forward, catching the subtle sounds of the pack's approach. Her whiskers twitched as she processed their location, numbers, and intent. These weren't just curious coyotes. They were hunting. The baby's cries had created an opportunity they couldn't resist. A low rumble formed in her chest, not yet a growl, but a warning to herself. Something was about to happen, something that would challenge everything humans thought they knew about these great predators. The cougar's tail twitched slightly, her eyes never leaving the family below as she prepared for what was to come. Sarah felt it first. That primal instinct that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She grabbed Mike's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike's body tensed, instinctively pulling Emma closer to his chest. The baby, sensing the change in her parents' demeanor, remained unusually quiet. That's when they saw her. Through the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, the cougar's massive form emerged like a ghost. Her tawny coat shimmered with each deliberate movement, muscles rippling beneath her fur. She was larger than any mountain lion they'd ever seen in wildlife documentaries, her presence commanding absolute attention. "Oh God," Mike breathed, his arms trembling slightly as he cradled Emma. The distance between them and the cougar was shrinking with each silent step. Sarah's mind raced through their safety training. Make yourself look big, make noise, never run. But their bodies refused to move, frozen in a mixture of terror and awe. The cougar's eyes, amber and intense, locked onto them. But there was something unusual in her gaze, something that didn't align with the predatory stare they expected. Her movements were careful, calculated, yet lacking the aggression typical of a hunting cat. Instead, she moved with an almost deliberate gentleness. Emma chose that moment to stir, letting out a soft whimper. Sarah's heart nearly stopped, expecting the sound to trigger the cougar's predatory instincts. But instead of pounking, the great cat paused, her ears swiveling forward with intense interest. Her head tilted slightly, almost like a curious house cat. The distance between them had shrunk to mere yards now, close enough that they could see the whiskers twitching on her broad face, the subtle rise and fall of her powerful chest with each breath. The morning sun caught the scattered scars on her face, testament to a life of survival in these harsh mountains. "Sarah," Mike whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "We need to move. We need to get out of here." But Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the cougar. Something about the animal's behavior didn't make sense. Every instinct told her they should be dead by now. Yet here they stood in some sort of surreal standoff with one of nature's most efficient predators. The cougar took another step forward, and Emma let out another small cry. Sarah's hand instinctively reached for their bear spray, but she hesitated. The big cat's reaction to Emma's cry was unlike anything she'd ever heard about predator behavior. Instead of triggering an attack response, the sound seemed to make the cougar more gentle? Time seemed to stand still in that moment, the forest holding its breath around them. The family stood paralyzed, their hearts pounding in unified terror as the massive predator drew even closer. But what happened next would challenge everything they thought they knew about these mysterious creatures of the wild. In a movement so fluid it seemed almost choreographed, the cougar suddenly shifted her position. Instead of continuing toward them, she moved to their side, placing her massive body between the family and the dense forest behind them. Her muscles were taut, alert, but her attention was no longer focused on them. The change was so unexpected that Sarah almost stumbled backward. Mike's grip on Emma tightened, but the baby, remarkably, had grown calm. The great cat's ears twitched rapidly, swiveling towards something in the undergrowth that the humans couldn't yet detect. Then they heard it, the subtle rustle of movement, the soft crunch of dead leaves under multiple sets of paws. From the shadows of the forest, yellow eyes appeared, low to the ground and hungry. The coyotes emerged one by one, their lean bodies slinking through the underbrush. The pack was large, at least 8 strong, and they moved with the confidence of experienced hunters. The cougar's reaction was immediate and stunning. Her entire demeanor changed as she let out a warning growl that seemed to shake the very air around them. It was a sound that contained all the power and authority of an apex predator, a sound that had evolved over millions of years to strike fear into the hearts of lesser predators. The effect on the coyotes was instant. The pack hesitated, their confident advance faltering. The lead coyote, a battle-scarred male, took a tentative step forward, testing the situation. The cougar's response was immediate. She rose to her full height, her muscles bunching under her tawny coat, and released a roar that echoed through the forest. Sarah and Mike watched in astonishment as the scene unfolded before them. The massive cat wasn't hunting them. She was protecting them. Each time a coyote tried to circle around, the cougar would shift her position, maintaining herself as a living barrier between the family and the threat. Emma, still cradled against Mike's chest, reached out a tiny hand toward the cougar's swishing tail, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around her. The baby's innocent gesture seemed to strengthen the big cat's resolve. Her growls grew deeper, more threatening, until finally the coyote pack began to retreat. One by one, the coyotes melted back into the forest, their hunting formation broken by the cougar's fierce defense. The pack's leader was the last to leave, offering a final snarl before disappearing into the undergrowth. The forest slowly began to return to its normal rhythm, but the cougar remained vigilant, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the pack's return. Sarah's scientific mind struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Everything she knew about mountain lion behavior told her this was impossible. Yet here they stood, alive and unharmed, protected by one of nature's most fearsome predators. The cougar turned her head slightly, meeting Sarah's gaze with those intelligent amber eyes. And in that moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. The sun had shifted in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees as the morning wore on. The cougar remained near them, her protective stance unwavering. As Sarah watched the magnificent creature, memories from her years of wildlife research began to surface, piecing together a possible explanation for this extraordinary behavior. 2 springs ago, rangers had tracked this same cougar, identifiable by the distinctive scar pattern on her face. She had been spotted numerous times with 3 cubs, a surprisingly large litter for a mountain lion. The mother had been remarkably successful at hunting, keeping her young ones well fed and protected. But nature can be cruel, even to its most powerful creatures. A particularly harsh winter had swept through the region. Game became scarce, and the cubs, still too young to hunt effectively, struggled to survive. Rangers had found 2 of them, their small bodies frozen in a den. The 3rd was never found. The mother's mournful calls had echoed through the valleys for weeks afterward, a sound that haunted even the most seasoned Forest Service members. Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she made the connection. The cougar's behavior today wasn't just random. It was driven by something deeper, more primal. The sound of Emma's cries must have awakened those maternal instincts that had lain dormant since that tragic winter. The great cat's need to protect hadn't died with her cubs. It had merely been waiting for another chance to emerge. Scientists had documented similar cases of cross-species protection in the wild. Dolphins protecting seals from sharks, elephants sheltering antelopes, and even lions guarding human children. These rare occurrences challenged everything we thought we knew about predator behavior, suggesting that maternal instincts could transcend the boundaries of species. The cougar's ears suddenly perked forward, and her head turned sharply to the left. A branch cracked in the distance, probably a deer or elk moving through the underbrush. But the big cat's reaction revealed something remarkable about her current state of mind. Instead of showing hunting interest, she remained focused on her self-appointed duty of protection. Emma stirred in her carrier, making soft cooing sounds. The cougar's response was immediate but gentle. Her ears swiveled toward the baby, and her rigid posture softened slightly. It was as if the infant's sounds provided confirmation that her protective instincts were needed, wanted, serving a purpose that helped fill the void left by her lost cubs. Mike, who had been silent throughout this revelation, finally spoke. "I've heard stories," he whispered, "about animals in the wild showing unexpected kindness. I never thought—" His voice trailed off as he watched the cougar scan the forest with unwavering vigilance. The great cat's dedication to their safety was both humbling and extraordinary. Nature, it seemed, had more complex layers than humans had yet to understand. The cougar's behavior wasn't just instinct. It was a demonstration of emotional depth that many believed impossible in wild predators. As the reality of their situation settled in, Sarah and Mike's initial terror began to transform into something else entirely. The cougar's protective presence, while still awe-inspiring, no longer filled them with paralyzing fear. They watched as the great cat maintained her vigil, her powerful form a shield between them and any potential threats lurking in the forest. Emma, displaying the innocent wisdom that sometimes only babies possess, had completely relaxed in her career. Her earlier cries had given way to curious coos and gurgles, each sound drawing the cougar's attention. The big cat's ears would twitch at every noise the baby made, her head turning slightly as if to check on her small charge. "I never thought I'd say this," Sarah whispered to Mike, "but I actually feel safer with her here." Her hands had stopped trembling, and she found herself studying the cougar with growing fascination. The magnificent creature's behavior defied everything she'd been taught about wild predators. Yet here they were, experiencing something extraordinary. Mike slowly shifted his position, careful not to make any sudden movements. The morning sun had grown warmer, and Emma needed to be shielded from its direct rays. As he moved, the cougar's eyes tracked his movement, not with aggression, but with what appeared to be careful consideration. Once Emma was safely in the shade, the big cat's attention returned to scanning their surroundings. Several times during these peaceful moments, Emma reached out toward the cougar, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. Each time, the great cat would acknowledge the gesture with a subtle turn of her head, her amber eyes softening in a way that seemed almost maternal. It was as if some unspoken connection had formed between the wild predator and the human infant. "Look at her muscles," Mike observed quietly, his photographer's eye catching details he'd missed in their initial panic. "The way she moves, it's like watching liquid power. But there's such control, such gentleness." The cougar's massive shoulders rippled with each small movement, a reminder of the incredible strength contained within her frame. Sarah found herself torn between her scientific training and the emotional impact of what they were witnessing. Everything she knew about mountain lion behavior told her this was impossible, yet the evidence was right before her eyes. The cougar wasn't just tolerating their presence, she had actively chosen to protect them. As the day wore on, their fear continued to fade, replaced by a profound sense of privilege. They were experiencing something few humans ever would, a genuine connection with one of nature's most misunderstood predators. The cougar remained alert, standing guard through the warmest part of the day, her dedication unwavering. Emma had fallen asleep again, her peaceful breathing joining the natural sounds of the forest. The cougar's ears would occasionally flick in the baby's direction, checking on her, before returning to their vigilant monitoring of the surrounding wilderness. The great cat's presence had become a source of comfort rather than fear, a paradigm shift that none of them could have anticipated when they set out on their hike that morning. Dark clouds began rolling in from the west, casting ominous shadows across the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a cold wind whispered through the trees, carrying the unmistakable scent of approaching rain. Sarah checked their GPS again, her heart sinking as she realized they had somehow strayed far from their intended path during the earlier chaos. "Mike," she whispered, showing him the device. "We're at least 4 miles off course." The realization hit them both hard. They were lost in an increasingly dangerous situation. The weather was turning, daylight would eventually fade, and they had a baby to protect. Their water supply was running low, and Emma would need feeding again soon. The cougar seemed to sense the changing conditions. Her muscles tensed as thunder rumbled in the distance, and her eyes scanned the darkening forest with increased intensity. The approaching storm would make tracking more difficult, masking sounds and scents that could warn of danger. A sharp crack echoed through the trees as a dead branch fell nearby, causing them all to jump. Emma startled awake, beginning to fuss in her carrier. The sound of her cries was different now, hungry, tired, and frightened by the thunder. Mike tried to comfort her, but the baby's distress was evident. The forest itself seemed to be transforming around them. Shadows deepened as the storm clouds thickened overhead, and the wind picked up strength, creating eerie whistles as it passed through the trees. The peaceful woodland of morning had become a maze of potential dangers, slippery slopes, hidden drop-offs, and the ever-present threat of other predators. Suddenly, the cougar's head snapped toward a dense thicket to their right. Her body lowered slightly, and a low growl rumbled in her chest. Through the gathering gloom, they caught glimpses of movement, perhaps the coyotes returning, or something else drawn by Emma's cries. The great cat's muscles bunched, ready for action if needed. But instead of attacking or defending, the cougar did something unexpected. She took several deliberate steps away from the family, then stopped and looked back at them. When they didn't move, she repeated the action, more emphatically this time. Her behavior was clear. She wanted them to follow. "She's trying to lead us somewhere," Sarah realized, her scientific mind racing to make sense of this unprecedented behavior. The cougar took a few more steps, then waited again, her tail twitching with what almost looked like impatience. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the leaves overhead. They had little choice. Staying put in a strengthening storm wasn't an option, especially with Emma. Making a decision, Mike adjusted Emma's carrier and nodded to Sarah. "I think we should trust her," he said softly. "She's protected us this far." With the storm building behind them and darkness creeping in, the family took their first tentative steps after their unlikely guide, venturing deeper into the wild but somehow feeling safer than they had all day. The cougar moved through the forest with purposeful grace, choosing a path that seemed random at first, but gradually revealed its wisdom. She led them along game trails and natural clearings, avoiding the treacherous terrain that humans might have stumbled into. Every few yards, she would pause, looking back to ensure her charges were still following, her patience remarkable for a wild predator. Sarah noticed how the great cat deliberately slowed her pace when the ground became slippery from the rain, waiting until they had safely navigate each challenging section. The storm continued to build overhead, but the dense canopy provided some shelter from the worst of it. Lightning occasionally illuminated the darkness, casting strange shadows through the trees. "Look," Mike whispered, pointing to a steep ravine they were skirting. "We would have walked right into that if we'd gone straight." The sheer drop was nearly invisible in the gathering gloom, masked by deceptive undergrowth. The cougar had led them on a wider path, avoiding the danger entirely. Emma had settled into a peaceful sleep despite the thunder, her tiny face pressed against Mike's chest. The cougar's ears would twitch at each rumble, but her focus remained sharp. Suddenly she froze, her muscles tensing. A massive tree branch, weakened by the storm, came crashing down mere feet in front of them. The family stumbled backward, but the cougar stood her ground, ensuring the path was clear before proceeding. As they continued their careful journey, other eyes watched from the shadows. The occasional flash of reflected light revealed curious or hungry gazes, but the presence of the mountain lion kept potential threats at bay. No creature dared challenge the authority of the region's apex predator, especially one displaying such obvious protective behavior. The cougar's path took them through a natural tunnel formed by fallen logs and thick vegetation. Sarah realized this route offered protection not just from the weather, but from being spotted by anything hunting from above. The big cat's knowledge of the forest's hidden pathways was proving invaluable. "She's not just leading us," Sarah murmured, her voice filled with wonder. She's teaching us. Every path she chooses has a purpose." Mike nodded, noticing how their feline guide would occasionally mark their trail, leaving signs they could follow if they somehow got separated. A particularly close lightning strike illuminated a startling scene. A fresh bear print in the mud, massive and recent. The cougar had already adjusted their course, steering them away from the potential encounter before they even realized the danger. Her wilderness wisdom, honed by years of survival, was keeping them safe from threats they couldn't even perceive. Through it all, the great cat maintained her protective vigil, her powerful presence a constant reassurance in the increasingly challenging conditions. She was guiding them not just through a forest, but through a complex web of natural hazards and hidden dangers, her every decision calculated to keep her adopted charges safe. Through the sheets of rain, a faint glow appeared in the distance. At first, Sarah thought it might be another lightning flash, but the light remained steady. The cougar had paused atop a small rise, her silhouette majestic against the stormy sky. As they drew closer to her position, Sarah's heart leaped. Through the trees, she could make out the distinct shape of the ranger station's radio tower. "Mike!" she gasped, grabbing his arm. "I know where we are now. That's Thompson Ridge Station." The realization that they were approaching familiar territory brought a surge of relief. The cougar stood watching them, her amber eyes reflecting an almost human-like satisfaction at their recognition. The great cat had led them in a wide arc through the forest, avoiding the treacherous ravines and steep slopes that made up the more direct route. What would have been an impossible journey in the storm had become manageable under her guidance. Every path she had chosen now revealed its strategic importance. Emma stirred in her carrier, making small sounds of contentment despite the weather. The cougar's ears swiveled toward the baby's noises, as they had done countless times during their journey. But now there was something different in the big cat's posture. A subtle shift that suggested their time together was drawing to a close. As they descended toward the station, familiar landmarks began to emerge through the rain. The old Douglas fir that had been struck by lightning years ago, its split trunk a welcome sight. The distinctive rock formation that local hikers had nicknamed the Sentinel. Each feature confirmed they were on the right path. The cougar's pace slowed as they approached the edge of the deep forest. The lights of the ranger station were clearly visible now, perhaps half a mile away across more open terrain. The big cat stopped at the tree line, her powerful form tense with obvious reluctance to proceed further. Sarah understood immediately. They had reached the boundary between the wild creature's domain and the world of humans. Despite the extraordinary bond that had formed between them, some lines couldn't be crossed. The cougar couldn't follow them into the realm of civilization. Mike turned to their remarkable guide, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing the words were inadequate for what the animal had done for them. The cougar's gaze met his, and for a moment, the connection between them was almost tangible. Through the diminishing rain, they could see movement at the ranger station. People had spotted them and were heading their way with flashlights. Soon they would be safe, surrounded by the comforting presence of other humans. But as Sarah looked back at their magnificent protector, she felt a surprising reluctance to say goodbye. The cougar stood regally at the forest's edge, rain glistening on her tawny coat, her mission nearly complete. She had led them from danger to safety, protected them from threats both seen and unseen, and shown them a side of nature few humans would ever witness. The approaching voices from the ranger station grew louder, flashlight beams cutting through the misty rain. Sarah and Mike stood at the threshold between two worlds, caught in a moment they knew would never come again. The cougar remained perfectly still, her powerful presence a final guardian gesture before their paths would diverge. Emma, as if sensing the significance of the moment, reached out one last time toward the great cat. Her tiny hand stretched through the rain, droplets catching on her small fingers. The cougar's response was extraordinary. She took one step forward, touching her nose to the air in Emma's direction, a gesture so gentle it brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "I never thought I'd say this to a mountain lion," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "But I wish you could stay." The cougar's ears twitched at her words, those intelligent amber eyes holding her gaze for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that silent exchange, Sarah felt she understood something profound about the connection between all living things. Mike shifted Emma in her carrier, protecting her from the last of the rain. "How do we even begin to explain this to anyone?" he wondered aloud. "Who would believe that a cougar led us to safety?" The great cat's tail moved slightly, almost like a farewell gesture. The voices were much closer now. "We can see you," a ranger called out. "Stay where you are, we're coming to help." The flashlight beams were growing brighter, threatening to illuminate their remarkable companion. The cougar knew it too, her muscles tensed, preparing for departure. But before she left, the magnificent creature did something that left them speechless. She sat down just for a moment and let out a soft sound. Not a growl or a snarl, but something almost like a purr. It was a sound that seemed to carry all the complexity of their shared journey, a farewell that transcended species. Then, with fluid grace that made her movement seem almost like an illusion, the cougar turned and began to fade into the forest. Her tawny coat merged with the shadows, but her eyes remained visible for a few seconds longer, two glowing amber points in the darkness. Then, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight, she was gone. The rangers reached them just moments later, their questions and concerns washing over the family like the rain that was finally beginning to ease. Sarah felt Mike's hand find hers, squeezing gently. They both knew that trying to explain what had happened would be nearly impossible. Emma made a small sound, not of distress, but almost like a goodbye of her own. Looking back at the forest's edge, Sarah could have sworn she saw those amber eyes one last time, watching, protecting, until they were truly safe. Then the darkness between the trees was empty, holding only the memory of their extraordinary guardian. Inside the ranger station, wrapped in warm blankets with hot drinks in their hands, Sarah and Mike faced the inevitable questions. Ranger Tom Collins, a veteran of 20 years in the Forest Service, sat across from them, his weathered face a mixture of concern and curiosity as they recounted their experience. "Let me get this straight," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "You're saying a mountain lion not only didn't attack you, but actively protected you and led you to safety?" His pen hovered over his incident report form, unsure how to document such an unprecedented event. Sarah understood his skepticism. "I know how it sounds," she replied, cradling Emma, who was now contently drinking from her bottle. "If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't believe it either." She described the cougar's behavior in detail, her scientific background lending credibility to her observations. As they spoke, other rangers gathered around, drawn by the extraordinary nature of the story. One of them, a wildlife specialist named Maria Rodriguez, suddenly straightened up. "Wait," she interrupted. "This cougar, did it have a distinctive scar pattern on its face, almost like 3 parallel lines?" Mike nodded eagerly. "Yes, exactly. You know about her?" Maria pulled out a thick file from a nearby cabinet, spreading photographs across the table. There she was, their protector, captured in various trail camera images over the years. "We've been tracking this particular female for almost 5 years," Maria explained, her excitement growing. "She's unusually large for a female cougar, and we've documented some strange behavior before, but nothing like this." She proceeded to tell them about the cougar's history, including the tragic loss of her cubs. News of their experience spread quickly. By morning, local media had picked up the story. Wildlife experts from across the country began calling, eager to document what could be one of the most extraordinary cases of cross-species protection ever recorded. "We've had reports from other hikers," Ranger Collins admitted, shuffling through some papers. "Stories about feeling watched in the forest but never threatened. A lost child who swears at a big cat led him back to the trail. We always dismissed them as imagination or luck, but now..." The scientific community was equally captivated. Dr. James Morrison, a renowned expert in predator behavior, arrived the next day to interview the family. "This challenges everything we thought we knew about mountain lion behavior," he declared, his eyes bright with academic excitement. The implications for our understanding of animal consciousness and emotional capacity are staggering. Through it all, Sarah and Mike tried to maintain perspective. While others debated the scientific significance, they couldn't forget the simple truth that something magical and inexplicable had happened in those woods. Emma, too young to understand, would nevertheless grow up with an extraordinary story to tell. As the story spread beyond the local community, scientists and animal behaviorists from around the world began sharing similar accounts of unexpected animal behavior. Dr. Sarah Chen, a renowned expert in predator psychology from Stanford University, presented compelling evidence of other documented cases where predators had shown protective instincts toward other species. What we witnessed with this cougar isn't entirely without precedent, Dr. Chen explained during a symposium hastily organized to discuss the incident. We've documented cases of lionesses in Africa adopting orphaned antelope calves, dolphins protecting seals from shark attacks, and even gorillas caring for human children who fall into their enclosures. These cases suggest that maternal instincts can sometimes override predatory behavior. The research team that arrived to study the area made several fascinating discoveries. Trail cameras they installed captured footage of the same cougar continuing to patrol the areas frequently used by hiking families, though she remained carefully hidden from direct view. It seemed her protective instincts extended beyond that single encounter. Local tribal elders from the Native American community came forward with ancient stories that suddenly carried new weight. Our ancestors always spoke of the mountain lion as a guardian spirit, explained Joseph Running Bear, a tribal historian. They told tales of the great cats leading lost children home, of protecting the vulnerable. Modern science dismissed these as myths, but perhaps there was truth in them all along. Behavioral scientists began conducting more extensive studies of predator emotions. Dr. Mike Thompson's groundbreaking research using MRI scans of big cats' brains revealed complex emotional centers previously thought to be unique to primates. These animals are capable of empathy, of emotional attachment, of making conscious choices that go against their instinctual drives, he reported. Sarah and Mike found themselves at the center of an emerging shift in how humans viewed these magnificent predators. Conservation groups reported increased public support for protecting big cats and their habitats. People began sharing their own stories of unexpected encounters with wildlife, painting a picture of a natural world far more complex than previously imagined. Emma's pediatrician, Dr. Rachel Martinez, offered an interesting perspective on why the baby might have played such a crucial role in the encounter. Infants produce specific pheromones and sounds that can trigger nurturing responses across species, she explained. Combined with the cougar's recent loss of cubs, these signals might have activated powerful maternal protective instincts. The scientific community continued to debate the implications. Some argued it was a unique case influenced by specific circumstances, while others saw it as evidence of a broader capacity for cross-species empathy in nature. What couldn't be denied was the impact the story had on public perception of these often misunderstood predators. A team of ethologists spent months studying the footage from that day, analyzing every movement and interaction. Their conclusion challenged traditional views of predator behavior. What we observed wasn't just instinct or coincidence, their report stated. It was a conscious choice made by a highly intelligent creature, demonstrating levels of emotional sophistication we're only beginning to understand. The impact of the cougar's remarkable act of protection rippled through the conservation community like a stone cast into still water. Within months, a grassroots movement emerged, centered around the story of the guardian cougar. Local community members, inspired by the events, formed the Mountain Lion Protection Alliance, dedicated to preserving these magnificent creatures and their habitats. Sarah and Mike found themselves becoming unexpected advocates for wildlife conservation. Their story resonated particularly with families, challenging the deep-seated fear many parents had about predators. What we experienced wasn't just about survival, Sarah explained during a community fundraising event. It was about understanding that these animals are capable of complexity far beyond our previous assumptions. The ranger station where they had found safety became a focal point for education and conservation efforts. Rangers developed new programs teaching visitors about mountain lion behavior, emphasizing coexistence rather than fear. Children were particularly drawn to Emma's story, now a toddler whose first words included a surprisingly accurate impression of a cat's purr. Local artists created murals depicting the scene, the mighty cougar leading the family through the storm. These images began appearing across town, becoming a symbol of the community's changed relationship with its wild neighbors. The original mural, painted on the side of the ranger station, became a popular spot for visitors to take photos and share their own wildlife encounters. Conservation efforts gained unprecedented support. When a development company proposed clearing part of the forest for a new resort, the community rallied together. "This isn't just about protecting animals," Mike spoke at a town council meeting, Emma on his hip. "It's about preserving the possibility of connection between species, about maintaining the mystery and wonder of the natural world." The scientific studies continued, yielding fascinating results. Trail cameras captured more instances of the same cougar exhibiting protective behavior, warning deer of approaching hunters, steering young bears away from dangerous areas, and continuing to watch over hiking trails from a distance. She became known locally as the Guardian, though she remained as wild and elusive as ever. Emma's story inspired a children's book series about wildlife conservation, with proceeds going to habitat protection. The books, beautifully illustrated with watercolor paintings of the forest and its inhabitants, taught children about respecting rather than fearing nature. The Guardian of the Forest became a beloved bedtime story in homes across the country. Local schools developed new curriculum units about predator behavior and ecosystem balance, using the cougar story as a launching point for discussions about human-wildlife interaction. Students learned about the important role apex predators play in maintaining healthy forests, and how human fear often leads to misunderstanding of these crucial species. The movement grew beyond their small community, inspiring similar initiatives in other regions where humans and large predators shared territories. The cougar's act of protection had become a catalyst for change, transforming fear into understanding, conflict into cooperation. 5 years had passed since that remarkable day in the forest. Emma, now a curious 6-year-old with her mother's love for nature, stood at the edge of the same trail where their extraordinary encounter had begun. Her small hand gripped Sarah's tightly as they gazed into the familiar woods, now designated as the Guardian Cougar Wildlife Preserve. "Tell me the story again, Mommy," Emma pleaded, her eyes bright with excitement, though she'd heard it countless times. Sarah smiled, remembering how different these woods had felt 5 years ago. Now, instead of fear, she felt a deep connection to this wild place and its inhabitants. The forest had changed, yet remained timeless. New trails had been carefully designed to protect both wildlife and hikers, with educational signs explaining the delicate balance between humans and predators. The old ranger station had been transformed into a research center, where scientists continued to study and document remarkable instances of animal behavior. As they walked along the maintained path, Emma stopped at each educational marker, reading about the forest's inhabitants. Her favorite was the large bronze plaque depicting the cougar's profile, complete with the distinctive 3-line scar pattern that had made her so recognizable. Though the great cat hadn't been spotted in recent months, her presence was still felt throughout these woods. "Look," Emma whispered suddenly, pointing to a fresh paw print in the soft earth beside the trail. It was large, clearly belonging to a mountain lion, and remarkably fresh. Sarah felt a familiar thrill run through her as she examined the print. The size matched perfectly with their old friend. High above them, in the dense canopy of an ancient Douglas fir, something moved. A flash of tawny coat, a glimpse of muscled shoulder, there and gone so quickly they might have imagined it. But Sarah knew better. The Guardian was still here, still watching, still protecting her domain. Mike, who had been photographing wildlife further down the trail, joined them quietly. "Did you see her?" he asked softly, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck. Emma nodded excitedly, her voice dropping to a whisper as she pointed to the trees where the shape had been. The family stood together, sharing a moment of connection with the wild that few others would understand. The forest around them was alive with afternoon sounds, birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant sound of a stream. But underlying it all was something else, a sense of being watched over, protected, welcomed. "She remembers us," Emma said with the absolute certainty of a child. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand, knowing that in some inexplicable way, she was right. The bond forged that day 5 years ago hadn't faded. It had grown, evolved, become part of the forest's endless cycle of life and protection. Rangers reported occasional sightings of the guardian, always from a distance, always watching over hikers and families who ventured into her territory. Young cubs had been spotted with her recently, suggesting that life had come full circle. She was a mother again, passing on her unique legacy of protection and understanding to a new generation. The research center had documented dozens of cases where hikers reported feeling a protective presence in the woods. Though few ever caught more than a glimpse of the great cat, her influence was undeniable. The forest had become a place of healing, where the boundary between wild and tame, between fear and understanding, had softened into something new and beautiful. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, they made their way back along the trail. Behind them, unseen but ever present, their guardian watched them go, her legacy living on in the changed hearts and minds of all who would come to these woods, seeking not just adventure, but connection with the wild spirit that had brought them all together. The guardian's story had become more than just a tale of survival. It was a testament to the profound bonds that could form between species, a reminder that in the vast wilderness of life, sometimes the most extraordinary protection comes from the most unexpected sources.